All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our session today. So I am Mac Marston. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and archaeology at Boston University, and I'm the director of the program in archaeology. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, David Carballo, professor of anthropology, archaeology, and Latin American studies, and he's going to be helping me with the moderation of today's event. I want to begin by introducing our series. So this is a series for emerging scholars, and those are defined by the university as individuals who are working on their dissertations or have just very recently completed their PhDs. And this is the second of our two symposia for this semester. These symposia are sponsored by Boston University's Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the College of Arts and Sciences. The theme of these symposia is the historical archaeology of the African diaspora in the Americas. And today's symposium is titled African Diasporas in Latin America and the Caribbean. This session is being recorded, and we're going to post the recording of the session, including all of the presentations and the questions and answers from today's session, on our YouTube channel in the coming days. And we'll make sure that a message is sent to everybody who's registered for this meeting with a link to that. We have four exciting scholars today: Rebecca Davis, Gabby Amoni Hartiman, Dr. Elena Sessma, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Daniela Ballenzategli. I'll introduce each briefly prior to their presentation. So the schedule for our symposium today will be presentations from each of our four panelists in turn, and then a question and answer session moderated by Professor Carballo. We're in a Zoom webinar format, so only the panelists are visible and audible, but you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A function. And Professor Carballo will then ask those questions of the panelists during the Q&A session. If you would like to direct your question to a specific panelist or couple of panelists, please note that in the question. We're going to wrap up promptly at 3 p.m. Boston time in 2 hours. And so let's move on to our first presentation. So our first presenter is Rebecca Davis. Rebecca is a PhD student in anthropology at UC Santa Cruz, and she holds an MA from the University of Newcastle upon Tyre in the UK and a BA from Elmira College. She's held a number of fellowships, including a DAX NEH Fellowship in Material Culture. DAX, for those who aren't aware, is the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, and she holds certification in their recording system. She's also been a graduate pedagogy fellow for the UC Santa Cruz Center for Innovations in Teaching and Learning. Her talk today is entitled Traversing Pre-Revolutionary Plantations of St. Domingue, How Enslaved Individuals Navigated the Caribbean's Most Profitable Colony. Rebecca.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to talk. You're gonna have to forgive me. I'm a little nervous. I'm still new at this, and I'm not usually giving talks to anybody but board undergraduates. So let me share my screen. There we go. Okay, so yes, traversing pre-revolutionary plantations of Saint Domingue, how enslaved individuals navigated the Caribbean's most profitable colony. I also need to give a little disclaimer before we get started. My research is a little lopsided due to the COVID world we find ourselves in and the current political unrest that's taking place in Haiti. So I'm currently working mainly from colonial maps and theory and comparative analysis. And I'm, again, because of the pandemic, I'm changing my dissertation site to a plantation site in Frederick County, Maryland, that has connections to Saint Domingue. And with that, let's see here. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to colonial Saint Domingue. Just to give a little background, by the 17th century, France began to steadily and increase their presence and influence over the western portion of the island, cultivating communities and trade. It wasn't until the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 that Spain officially ceded the control over this portion of the island to France and was divided it officially into French Saint-Domingue on the west and Spanish Santo Domingo on the east. France's economic and political influence, which really began 40 years prior to the treaty, gradually moved south to claim the rest of the western portion of the island, forming the historically recognized colony of Saint-Domingue. It was one of the last colonies to be established in the Caribbean, and it occupied only 1/3 of the island and eventually developed into a powerhouse throughout the Antilles. By the late 17th century, there is a rise in settlement and development of the plantation economy, starting with tobacco and indigo. The economy would then expand and eventually begin to rely on surplus crops such as sugarcane and coffee. So this reliance on sugar and coffee production initiated an influx of settlement and social stratification within the colony. The society consisted of 4 distinct groups, and each harbored their own concerns and agendas that eventually helped inflame discontent within the colony. The first tier of society were the white planters, who comprised 10% of the population while owning the majority of the land, of course. This class was typically united along racial lines. However, there were distinctions made within the class between, well, it was based on wealth and occupation. So we have the Grand Blancs, the landowners who rarely lived in the colony, or if they did, they divided their time between the colony and France. Then we have the Petit Blancs, where who were the poorer whites, often the managers of plantations, estates, clerks, seamen, men and women in trade, and indentured servants. Then we have the gens de couleur, free people of color, who, and this group actually had a membership that was slightly ambiguous and ranged from formerly enslaved individuals to French Creole landowners, people of biracial or Afro-European ancestry. This population was common in all plantation societies, of course. However, the free people of color in Saint-Domingue were remarkable for its size and cumulative wealth and power by the time the colony reached its peak. Where there were roughly 40,000 whites in the colony, there were approximately 30,000 gens de couleur. And then, of course, we have the enslaved laborers, who represented the majority of the population. Again, similar to the free people of color, the enslaved population grew to impressive numbers during the late 18th century. And general consensus is that there were approximately 500,000 enslaved individuals present at the height. Of the 500,000 that is estimated, 2/3 of the population were African born. So again, that kind of gives you the dynamic of the amount of enslaved bodies that were being, for lack of a better term, fed into the plantation system of Saint-Domingue. And when I first began researching Saint-Domingue in 2013, the first book I read was Carolyn Fick's 1990 book, The Making of Haiti from Below. And it was this passage that really kind of struck me, the last line in particular, for a whole host of, because it indicates a whole host of possibilities that could be discovered by prioritizing the motives, the initiatives, and the autonomy present in some of the daily choices of enslaved daily life. There's no denying that the French Revolution had considerable impact on France's colonies in the Caribbean. However, I think that the amount of emphasis placed on the French Revolution as paving the way for the Haitian Revolution is a disservice to the enslaved population present. So for me, the devil really is in the details. When we understand the ways enslaved individuals moved through their environment, we can piece different aspects of their narrative together. How are they able to survive? How they were able to provide for themselves, to trade and to develop networks. Asking and answering each of these points will lead us towards an explanation of how enslaved populations of Saint-Domingue were able to move from stolen captives, like we see in Livingston's famous rendering at the top right of their screen, to the revolutions we see at the bottom of the screen and the infamous Block Cayman ceremony that orchestrated the largest successful enslaved revolution of the Atlantic world. So to sift through those details, I wanted to look at different aspects of the plantation landscape that the plantation landscape possessed. And following Heath's definition, 2010 definition, space is used in reporting physical dimensions or characteristics of architecture and landscape, while place refers to the constructed meaning of space through individual experiences, memories, and the specificity of the landscape. If the plantation space was the warp, the scale, size, and design used to enforce rigid systems of economy, control, then place would be the weft of human experiences and actions, the development of survivance strategies and meaning making, the threads of daily life that are confined by the frame but creatively woven through practice and resolve. And my research seeks to recognize the intended Euro-American frameworks implemented, but seek and understand how enslaved social and cultural and even economic ideals present themselves in those same built environments. So when we think, let's see here, when we, and I think this might be a little, yeah. So when we think about the warp of the plantation, we need to think about the ecological considerations, because no plantation system was the same, right? It all depended on various aspects or details. So for ecological considerations, Higman states, the four great desiderata in settling plantations are goodness of soil, easiness of access, convenience of distance from shipping place, and a stream of water running through premises. Although an estate may prove very productive without a union of all these advantages, it would be a folly to settle upon a tract of land that possessed neither of them. So and then we go on to plantation layouts. Again, we're kind of outlining the framework here. So onto plantation layouts. Generally followed a neoclassical or Georgian architectural spatial styles. And when I say Georgian, it's actually, if you look at a Georgian manor house, you'd be able to kind of draw a line down the middle and it would be a mirror image on both left and right side. Okay, so we've got symmetrical building techniques, temple-like main houses, geometrical spatial organization, especially within the landscape and the gardens and orchards associated, motifs from antiquity and surveillance, again, very key. Not only that, but economic efficiency surrounding the nucleated center and the workforce size. Okay, so access to architectural information and building methods. This all represents the spread of a popular culture from the metropole, but it places the plantation within a global socio-cultural economic framework, right? Not only access to architectural information and building methods, capital to initiate ventures without kind of immediate returns, because plantations didn't start out profitable by any means. And especially in enslaved bodies, were the hallmark and privilege of a select group of people. Therefore, one of the best ways to understand that colonial Euro-American perspective and their associated worldviews is through the lens of a plantation and the spatial layouts presented. So with that, and to get a better understanding of the plantation warp, my first example here is Labourie's 18th century depiction of the ideal, quote unquote, ideal coffee plantation. So coffee plantations were smaller operations common in the hills and mountains of Saint-Domingue rather than the larger, more profitable sugar estates that were located down by the coastline. So when a visitor, a visitor approached the estate via the road marked P right here along the bottom of the screen, they would travel near the first of first 3 of 6 enslaved barracks labeled L, hinting at the size and prestige of the operation, just before turning on to a tree-lined avenue. The trees would have been used to simultaneously hint at the size of the enslaved workforce space present, while providing a natural boundary or shield from certain aspects of its use. The trees would further emphasize and focus the visitor's attention on the main house at the end of the avenue. In describing an 18th century Virginia plantation, a tutor named Philip Fithian stated, "The rows of poplars form an extremely pleasant avenue, and at the road through them, the house appears most romantic at the same time that it does truly elegant." This is from Upton's 1984 book. This tree-lined feature was a common plantation aspect throughout the Atlantic world and leads to the nucleated center. Again, a space that was geared to inspire the casual visitor while it intimidated the inhabitants of the plantation. While there is no concrete layout of the nucleated center, this area is often characterized by minimal distances between the 3 key regions: agricultural to production areas. So note the differences between K, G, F, and E and H on the map. The planter's house to the main production centers / surplus stores. And lastly, enslaved spaces to agricultural areas. So for this map, it's L, K, G, F, E, and H. It was both economically efficient and panoptically expedient for centralized work areas to ensure that high levels of production were maintained, in addition to surveillance and self-surveillance of the enslaved. The main house is flanked on either side by the mill, labeled E, and the kitchen and hospital and outhouse complex, labeled D. The placement of these buildings is in direct line of sight from the main house and in close proximity to the enslaved barracks. These buildings, along with the main house, act as a type of barrier between the agriculture production areas, the formal gardens, and residential areas. An almost optical gate that the enslaved would need to pass through daily on their trek to and from work. And the spatial layout presented here is reminiscent of Palladian planning, which emphasized symmetry, perspective views, and Romanesque architecture, a planning style which was complementary to the Georgian order, emphasis on regimented and restrictive use of space. Another landscape element found under the Palladian paradigm and used when possible was the placement of the planter's house on elevated ground, dictating how the house was observed from below, but also how those below were surveilled. So the advantage of the elevated position and the associated sightlines allowed for surveillance in 2 ways. The enslavers over the enslaved and self-surveillance, a concept that was developed by Foucault. If the self-surveillance concept were applied to Labour's model, the seemingly flat landscape, in particular, the tree-lined space near the enslaved barracks, the trees take on an added meaning, not only to shield enslaved spaces from Euro-American eyes, but to bolster the need for self-surveillance, what could and could not be seen through the tree line by the owner or overseer. The placement of the enslaved barracks near the road may have been another type of surveillance, a facet of surveillance where adjacent neighbors or visitors to the property could report on prohibited activities and kind of landscape line spots. Again, other features of note in Labour's plan are the formal gardens located south of the main house and an adjacent orchard, the irrigation system to the fields, which is labeled I. And lastly, the bell tower, which is Q, which you see at the tip of one of the barracks. These features, their purpose, and their physical manifestations emphasize the Euro-American frameworks of economic efficiency, the popularity of neoclassical architectural styles, domination and management of enslaved time and bodies. Let's see here. So when we think, though Labour's depiction is a model, kind of this representation of a real plantation that was located in the mountains of Jérémie and was drawn by Mandel in 1775. Similar to what was mentioned previously about ecological concerns, we see here what appears to be green, thriving land, abundant water sources, well-defined primary and secondary roads. There were also well-defined spaces for cultivations of crops, separate living quarters for the main family, domestic servants and field servants, as well as various functional decorative gardens. And I know that this is, it's really kind of hard to see, but there is I have a blown up version later on. But again, we see primary and secondary roads. These over here labeled 9 would be enslaved workers who worked in the field. This is their provision ground. This would be, this right here would be the crop, both here and across the road, the main road. So when we think of the weft of plantation life, this quote by Dr. Chan illustrates it nicely. Landscape is more than a visual arrangement. It becomes the backdrop for human action. The relationship between people and landscape is an element of articulation of everyday actions. It is this connection which allows for the researcher to see the landscape as a text, a source of study that enhances the dialogue of people in their lives. So when we take, looking for that dialogue of people, let's start to compare the Laborie and Mandel maps. The Mandel map of this plantation would have been a contemporary of when Laborie was designing his coffee plantation. And between the two examples here, we see the same placement of the main house at the end of a tree-lined path. So we've got A in Laborie and 1 in Mandel. Unlike Laborie, the family stores are located near the main house, which is 2 on both sides. And on Laborie, it's part of the main house structure. There are well-ordered decorative colonial gardens at the rear of the house, B and 5, separate kitchens from the main house in close proximity to the enslaved quarters. So 5 right here would be the kitchens. This is the domestic servants, domestic enslaved right here. Bell towers that were used both for surveillance and time management. We can see in Q, again, right here on Laborie, and 15, which is really hard to see, but it's just outside the main house. Again, we see the tree-lined avenue that hints at the enslaved quarters, which again is positioned near the main road. So we have similarities here with L and then the domestic enslaved right here. The main road also looks directly into the enslaved quarter, further supporting Randall's claim about outside panoptic features and considerations used in landscape design. So this is a main road right here, and this is the enslaved quarter. And from the main road, you can look right into the quarter. And this again would be where the house yards are, where the communal living spaces would be. We also need to note the distances between the enslaved field workers and the provision grounds, so 9 and 11. And areas for surplus crops, the distances between the enslaved quarters and the nucleated center, so 9 and this area right here, which would be the mill. And then there are areas of landscapes of kind of alternate possibilities and central areas like on the backside of the enslaved quarters right here. Oh, on the backside of the enslaved quarters. Areas where there would have been, again, house yards, small scale economic production, small garden plots, or animal pens. Again, the purpose of the plantation space was a way to signal to a wider audience the wealth and prosperity of domination of the landscape and the people residing there, but it wasn't necessarily only about that. Okay, so thinking about, to get a better sense of sugar plantation dynamics, this is a 1785 map of Limonade in San Domingue. Fun fact, it was this bay right here where Columbus's Santa Maria became shipwrecked just after he quote unquote discovered the Americas. I want you to take notice of the parcels of land, the size of the parcels of land in comparison to the coffee plantations. The size and location near the bay assures that these were all sugar plantations and possess elements of the desired traits of Hegman that we were talked about above. Sugar plantations would necessitate well-defined nucleated centers, large workforces, and well-developed infrastructure to take finished products to the port. Again, the port being here along the water, well-defined infrastructures, ease of access, and that's exactly what we have here. But if we're thinking about the enslaved experience, we need to take a closer look, especially near Monsieur Funia. The size and the operation would have made full control of these spaces, enslaved spaces in particular, impossible, even with careful landscape design. The sheer number of barracks that we see in his plantation setup, which are these little kind of hashtag marks, would have made intra and interplantation community or communication among enslaved a certainty. And again, if we think about the closeness of the estates, we've got Monsieur Funet, and then we've got Monsieur de Mignac. Pardon me, my French is horrible. So we've got, it would have been simple, it would have been they would have been in contact, especially when we think about Black markets, trading networks, information networks, healthcare practices, and religious practices. So further examination of these plantations of this size may be able to tell us more about differentiation between enslaved individuals, not necessarily the narrow focus on status and ranking within the enslaved population, but rather neighborhood affiliations and different aspects of community formation. Communities and affiliations that don't necessarily conform to imposed Euro-American boundaries. And I'm trying to illustrate the dynamic nature of enslaved lives. And for this, I'm using this plantation map. This is actually from a plantation of Monsieur Chevalier de Prefontaine in Cayenne in French Guiana. And again, this is all research that needs more work, part of my research that needs more work.
Rebecca, I'm just noting the time.
Oh.
And we've been about 20 minutes now, so.
Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, sure thing.
I'm actually.
As you want to get to, towards the conclusion, that would be terrific.
100%, absolutely, absolutely. So again, we've got different kind of technical skills presented here in each of these plantation kind of elements here. But yes, absolutely, time. Thank you so much for telling me. So given what we've been discussing for the last while, I sincerely hope that when you look at a picture of a plantation like this, it looks different to you now, that you will be able to see the potential ways to add to the enslaved narrative, rather than thinking about this landscape in terms of being representative of a plantocracy and domination. With well-defined rankings and hierarchies, think of it as a Venn diagram with overlapping spheres. The ability of the enslaved to overlap, penetrate, and interact with other spheres, yes, depended on the frameworks, but put in place, but also their own initiative, their own motives, their own autonomy within the overall landscape. All right, so I'm so sorry for the time, and these are the references. Okay.
That was great. I just wanted to make sure you were aware, in case.
No, it wasn't. Thank you.
That was great. All right, wonderful. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I'm sure there'll be questions, and we'll have them again at the end of the session. So for anyone who joined late, we're going to have our 4 presentations, and then we're going to have all the questions at the end. But you can submit questions now through the Q&A. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please note that when you put your question in. So we're on to our second presentation. Our second presenter is Gabi Amoni Harteman. Gabi is a PhD student in anthropology at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. and holds an MA from the same. Gabby's MA thesis received the Society of Brazilian Archaeology's Excellence Award. Gabby's BA is from the University of Montreal, and you may be familiar with Gabby's work as a co-author of the recently published article in the SAA Archaeological Record, Anti-Racist Archaeology, Your Time is Now, that appeared in one of the editions of it last year in the 2020 edition. Gabby's talk today is Orality, Memory, and Afro-Amazonian Ontologies towards an anti-colonial archaeological praxis in Mana, Guyana.
Amazing. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see that?
It's coming up now, yes.
Okay, good. Abu Ishu Lara Ishu. May Orisha Ishu put the right words in my mouth. Abu Mogongo, asking my ancestors and my elders for permission to speak. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very thankful for this opportunity to learn and share some of my reflections with such great scholars and attendees here with us. Thank you, Mac, for this introduction. Before anything, I really want to invoke the words of two African thinkers from both the continent and the diaspora, starting with a poem called Lambe by poet, ethnologist, one of the founding members of the Negritude movement and fellow Afro-Guyanese person, Leon Gontran Damas, and then Igbo Nigerian Ijeoma Umebenyuwa's poem, Homeland. Give me back my black dolls so that I play with them, the naive games of my instinct, which has remained in the shadow of its laws. Recovered are my courage, my audacity. I become myself again, a new self, from what I was yesterday when the time of uprooting came. Will they ever know this rancor in my heart, open too late to the eye of my mistrust? They stole the space that was mine, the tradition, the days, the life, the song, the rhythm, the effort, the path, the water, the hut, the small gray earth, the wisdom, the words, the discussion, the elders. You could dance, the hands, the tempo, the stamping of feet, the ground. Give me back my black dolls, black dolls, black, black. You're made of water, distance, dreams, mother's tears, father's pain, broken tongue, forced language, colonized eyes, bastardized religions. You lost cultures, you lost languages, you lost religions. You lost it all in the fire that is colonization. So do not apologize for owning every piece of you they could not take, break, and claim as theirs. So as colonized people, and in my case, as a colonized person from the African diaspora, the dispossession of our world perception is one of our deepest and most painful colonial wounds. These two poems I just invoked here talk to this dimension of colonialism that seeks to annihilate worlds and world perceptions. Here, I want to address an issue which I believe is of interest and a concern to many archaeologists who are not only studying the African diaspora, but who are African and Afro-diasporic themselves, which is the concern of whether we're able or not to tell our stories to our own people. Recently, Senegalese archaeologist Dr. Ibrahima Thiaw has mentioned how archaeological knowledge production is for the most part extroverted, directed to hegemonic audiences in the West, in their languages and their codes. And I have shared his and the frustration of many other Black, African, and Indigenous archaeologists regarding this gap between the people whose past and whose ancestors are being studied by archaeology and those who have access to this knowledge. And while a considerable amount of work has been and continues to be done in order to bridge this gap, we need to keep raising questions regarding the place of archaeology in the struggle of colonized and marginalized people. And further, we need to keep interrogating if archaeology as a mode of knowledge actually has the capacity to serve people as it claims to be able to. So as we know, archaeology is a colonial discipline, but what I want to highlight here, further than just the historical processes of its creation, is its current positionality in terms of ontology and epistemology. Despite the tremendous work mostly done by indigenous archaeologists to think and practice archaeology based on more world perceptions, the archaeological mode of knowledge overwhelmingly still uses notions of materiality, space, and time, and very importantly, of knowledge and reality that are modern, Western, and Eurocentric in order to tell stories about humankind. And the many processes tied to the emergence of the African diaspora did not only lead to multiple reconfigurations of societies, cultural and spiritual traditions, but also and languages, but also to reconfiguration of ontologies and epistemologies. And so I keep coming back to the following questions. Are these Afro-diasporic notions of knowledge and reality present and activated in our archaeological praxis, not as objects of study, but as theoretical and methodological foundations of the work we do? And in my case, as an Afro-Guyanese archaeologist, how can I be a storyteller for my people if I only activate and um, a world perception that prevents me from even listening to the many stories that are already being told? And how can I tell my ancestors' stories in languages and through world perceptions which are neither theirs nor ours? Why are my elders' memories, knowledge, and world perceptions also not my own when I conduct my work? And the final and central one, who am I telling these stories to? So my need to center the archaeological work I do on these questions certainly comes from my position as an Afro-diasporic person from Guyana, which is an Amazonian territory that has been a colony of France since the 17th century. While it is officially called an overseas territory, the heavy structures that define Guyana's colonial relation to France are visible in many dimensions. For instance, an economic dependency, a systematic land dispossession, lack of employment, extremely limited local power to make any decisions, which are for the most part made in France. Specifically, the logics of coloniality are extremely present in the dimension of knowledge. Scientists, professors, teachers are mostly white French individuals who stay a few years because of financial incentives from the government, while a vast majority of the Guyanese population, who is Black, Afro-diasporic, and indigenous, does not necessarily occupy those spaces. In this context, what is defined and maintained as the sole legitimate knowledge, as well as the only linguistic and ontological references possible to create knowledge, are Western worldview and French language. So what is the legitimacy and the relevance of this archaeological knowledge that is based on and maintains a framework of epistemic violence, as well as the notions of heritage it activates? So in order to rethink if and how archaeology could be relevant for Afro-Guyanese people, I went back to my ancestral land, Mana. Mana was founded in 1836 by about 477 Africans, amongst whom was my ancestor Alais, at the time a 24-year-old woman with 2 small children. Mana's founders were African people who had been illegally taken captive after the slave trade was outlawed by France in 1818. The town of Mana, initially designed by French nun to be a utopian religious social experiment, became a 19th century self-sufficient community of non-enslaved Africans. Despite their later annexing to the rest of the colony emancipation in 1848, and the subsequent heavy migration flux related to mostly to gold mining, mostly from the Caribbean and Samaka Maroon traditional territory, Mun Mana, people from Mana, always maintain their specific identity. So I went back to Mana to learn with my elders, mostly my great aunts. Here, 3 of my great aunts depicted here, Tante Edez, Tante Manat, and Tante Eliane. And so I went back to them to learn about our own knowledge about past and present times. And so thinking of decolonial possibilities for an archaeological praxis in Guyana led me to first commit to the complex exercise of exclusively using Afro-Guyanese language to do archaeology and talk about archaeology, following the pathway of thinkers such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya. As I engaged in conversations with my elders to learn about other times, this choice of using an Afro-Guyanese linguistic reference quickly made appear ontological references which do not fit the modern Western notions of reality that are used by disciplinary archaeology. And to borrow the concept of quilombola knowledge holder from Brazil, mestre bispo, these are organic notions of reality. And these organic notions of reality, time, space, materiality, subjectivities, and knowledge that emerge from memory and which were used in our conversations, they were Afro-diasporic and Afro-Amazonians. While I won't have the time here to go into details about how each of these notions is understood in Mana, I want to specifically talk about our notions of materiality, which is directly tied to the ontological centrality occupied by orality in our notion, in our world perceptions. This centrality of orality is manifested by the vast range of different oral archives, such as conte, masak masak, dolo, respectively translatable as tales, riddles, and proverbs, as well as song lyrics. And so while what is material and what is immaterial are ontologically separate and opposed in modern Western references, one representing the other, African and Afro-diasporic world perceptions reveal a much different relation between the material and immaterial dimensions, where, for example, the word has the capacity to materialize and matter has communicative capacity. And so this connectedness is also manifested in Mana world perceptions, where everything exists both in its material and immaterial dimensions. So Betya things can therefore be materially expressed as tangible objects, fragments, photos, drawings, sculptures, architecture on our skin, for example, or also be present in an immaterial form, very much alive in our memory and our oral archives. So like I said, conte, masak masak, dolo, these riddles, proverbs, tales mainly, but also in dreams, for example. So many things from old times that are made of organic matter, as it is often the case in Amazonian contexts, such as basketry or old rooftops made of feiwai leaves or bardo, which are small pieces of wood, are not necessarily present physically, but they're well existing in our memory. And so things, their uses and who they used to belong to, as well as the skills to make them are often invoked in stories about old times. I really want to mention as an inspirational path, Somalian archaeologist Dr. Sada Mire, who is from and works in a similar context where oral traditions are very central, and which led her to creating a knowledge-centered approach to archaeology. This connection between the material and immaterial dimensions are made explicit when talking about an old iron. The photo is a little ugly, but it's down there. So about this old iron is made explicit because it was both used to iron clothes and to maintain ill-intentioned spirits away from the house with its smell. Prohibitions or instructions regarding specific places also inform about this connection between material and immaterial dimensions of the world. For example, the cemetery or the seashore it constitute an illustration of this, as one is forbidden to go if they have an open wound or if they are menstruating or pregnant. Traditions of cleaning up our ancestors' grave while talking to them point to the importance of the connection with the ancestor realm and the material world within Munmana's perception. The old tamarind tree at the entrance of Mana, which was planted at the time of the foundation, is a protector of the town, as people would have to pass under it to enter Mana and immediately lose any spiritual weapon they were carrying. And so going back to my Afro-Guyanese world perceptions allowed me to focus on the communicative capacity of materiality, moving away from a modern Western ontological notion that things are silent, passive objects. Both people and things can be considered storytellers. It is their encounter that provokes the emergence of knowledge. As my great aunt, Tante Manot, suddenly noticed the bracelet on my wrist made of leather and cowrie shells, she told me that cowrie shells were understood to be bête africaine, African things, used for gado, an Afro-Guyanese term used to talk about divination practices. And so for the first time in my life, by going back to Mana and to my elders, I heard their names in Afro-Guyanese, Sumakeneg, which is a term translatable as money of Black people, pointing to the fact that their Western African use as a currency is organically known to Munmana. As many have said before me, archaeological knowledge does hold an interesting potential for African diasporic people and their global and local struggles through its uses of different archives, which are not solely the written Western archive. Yet the disciplinary and ontological tenets of this mode of knowledge, which overwhelmingly still serves hegemonic white Western subjects and interests, and which participates in the maintenance of coloniality, also renders it a violent science that silences our past and present existences while destroying our own surviving relations with materiality, space, time, and knowledge. And so thinking of an anti-colonial archaeological practice in Guyana is not about simply importing yet another modern Western knowledge and forcefully make it fit our realities. It is an exercise of questioning whether or not archaeology can be relevant for our struggles in order to continue to exist. And this exercise relies on acknowledging the ongoing process of epistemic and ontological violence and seeking other possibilities to recreate an archaeological mode of knowledge in Guyana that would be underpinned by our own ontological and epistemological references, where orality, the connection between materiality and immateriality, memory, our own notions of time, space, and knowledge are at the basis of this new kind of archaeology. Ending my presentation with other words from another African poet. The God of creation rambles through the ruins of broken worlds, and the process of reconstruction is also a process of demolition. That's it for now. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Excellent. All right, we will turn to our third presentation. Our third presenter is Dr. Elena Sessma. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Kentucky, and she previously held a University of California President's postdoctoral fellowship in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. She received her PhD in 2019, close to us, from University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her MA is from the same institution, and she holds a BA in Anthropology and Women's Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. She's received numerous grants from both the Wenner-Gren Foundation and the National Science Foundation, including at one point, a while ago now, I suppose, an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. course, a very prestigious award in and of itself. She's the co-editor of a forthcoming volume in the APAAA, that's the Archaeological Papers of the American Anthropological Association. And that edited volume is titled Exploring the Contemporary in Old Places. And of course, she's the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles. So her talk today is entitled Material Memoryscapes of Slavery and Freedom in the Bahamas.
Hi, great. Thank you so much, Mac, for that introduction. And thank you to BU for hosting. And to my fellow panelists, it's really exciting to be here virtually with you and to be in conversation about some exciting work. So I'm going to go ahead and get my share my screen to get my slides up. All right, so I will today be talking about the research that was the bulk of my dissertation research, and hopefully if I can get through it quickly enough, some expansion and where I'm sort of heading next with this research. So I want to start by giving some context to the site that I have been working on in the Bahamas on the island of Illusora. It is this kind of seahorse-shaped island. It's one of the family islands in the Bahamas, one of 700 islands and keys that make up the Bahama Islands. And the bulk of my research took place in the very southernmost tip, the southernmost end of the island of Illusora, focusing on a former cotton plantation from the first quarter of the 19th century. So to give a little bit of background on the island of Illusora, most of these, the family islands, so any island that's not Nassau or Grand Bahama, were heavily settled after the American Revolution when the English Crown resettled loyalists from predominantly from the Carolinas into these Bahamian islands. So Illusora, a lot of its population came from this initial loyalist immigration in the 1790s. And the plantation, the family owners of the plantation site where I have been researching, the Miller family, arrived in the Bahamas around the same period. And they initially settled on the island of Long Island before establishing a second plantation called the Miller's Estate on Illusora. So the island of Illusora has been an agricultural island since its initial founding by the English in the mid-17th century. Throughout the 19th century, it was a heavily agricultural island. There was initially in this loyalist period a big kind of cotton boom that was the attempt to recreate the cotton agriculture that was so prevalent in the southern colonies. And unfortunately, well, for the planters, the cotton did not do well on in these Bahamian soils. So the cotton economy really crashed within the first decade of the 1800s. The Miller's Estate was one of the few plantations that continued this cotton cultivation up until the period of emancipation in 1833. And at that point, many of the newly freed community members on the Miller's Estate stayed in place, as was the case on many of these islands. Newly emancipated slaves were staying in place, setting up communities on what was called generation land. And throughout into the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, Illusora really remained as a kind of agricultural powerhouse. It provided the agricultural products that were sold in market in Nassau, in the big city in Nassau. And so for a long time, agriculture was king, and then slowly tourism really took hold in the mid-20th century throughout Illusora. And to this day, there are still kind of the skeletons of some of these resorts, these all-inclusive resorts and boutique hotels that still exist on the island, although they're not necessarily still open and functioning. So the Miller's Plantation Estate was established in 1803, and the owner, Robert Miller, moved part of his enslaved workforce from the plantation in Long Island to Miller's. And in 1871, the final surviving member of the Miller family, Ann Miller, left this property along with the family's other properties in Nassau and on Long Island to the descendants of her former slaves and servants, many of whom she named specifically in her 1871 will. Many of these individuals had been living on this former property for decades at this point, for generations, and so they continue to stay on this land. And this is actually a fairly common phenomenon in the Bahamas, frequently referred to as generation land, where communities who most frequently sort of descend from the initially emancipated people in the 1830s remained and stayed and have this ancestral connection, although there isn't necessarily a legal definition of this generation land in the Bahamas. It is a really common feature throughout all of the islands. So this is a sort of zoomed in look at the southern end of Illusora, and these 4 settlements, which are circled in white, all sit on or immediately border part of this former Miller's plantation estate. So Miller's right here is where the bulk of the remaining plantation structures still stand, but many descendants of the enslaved population still live in these other settlements and even farther north on the island. So the work that I did at Miller's, in the Miller's area, I worked directly with the descendant community, with representatives, local residents from local organizations on the island, many of whom either are directly descended from people named in that 1871 will, or related by marriage, or related in having lived on this island for a very long time and having this deep connection. So when I first arrived in Illusora, I arrived with my dissertation advisor. At the time, I wasn't sure that this was going to be the site of my research for the following 6 years at that point. But we were beginning to investigate this plantation estate, the property, the sort of historic plantation structure is what was still standing. But when we arrived, it was actually a matter of weeks after this major court case in the Supreme Court in the Bahamas over this contestation of rights to land, much of which was part of this former Miller's estate. So in conversations, like casual conversations, not even formal interviews, but just talking with people, there was a real sense of fear that this attempted land grab was going to dispossess them of their ancestral land. There was a real sense that the judicial system was not listening to their stories, listening or respecting their oral histories and their understanding of their connections to this land, and that the will that had specifically named them as inheritors of this land was not being recognized as a legal title. And so because of that, very early on, my understanding of the site, my understanding of the potential for archaeological research here shifted from one that was no longer strictly about the Miller's plantation and its operation up until the 1830s, but about the collective experience, the collective history, the 200 years of history in this part of the island, and how people still relate to and understand their relationship to that historic property today. So in developing the research project, just to give you a sense of how I kind of compose this research, I incorporated community-based and participatory research methods. I worked with research partners, with local descendants, with the local libraries and schools, with organizations and community leaders to develop a project that was useful and interesting and potentially helpful to the ongoing issues that were unfolding on the island. I also was really informed theoretically by Black feminist archaeology. And in terms of bringing together the method and the theory, I was also noticed sort of as I was going, this wasn't always the intention, that what I was doing was also very much grounded in ethnography. And so a lot of the analysis was really based on this kind of archaeological ethnography. And because of that, I see a lot of this work, which began as a kind of a traditional historical archaeology of a plantation site, became a contemporary archaeology of a much broader question around land and memory in the Bahamas. And so I also, as I go through the rest of this presentation, and I would be happy to talk more about some of the methods and the data that I pulled into this work, but I was really inspired by this concept of braiding knowledge that Sonia Atalay puts out about bringing together archaeological data, multiple kinds and modes of data to create a new and richly textured interpretation of the past. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily look like archaeology as we so often know it, but I think it produces a really nuanced and an exciting way of understanding historical and contemporary materiality. So I'll talk about two specific kinds of materiality that I focused on in this research. The first is on these patterns of vernacular architecture that I noticed in many of these settlements in the southern part of the island. So as I was conducting pedestrian surveys, walking interviews, sort of windshield surveys, driving through this dense, overgrown areas and parts of this island, I started noticing that a lot of these homes, both ones that were still lived in, still occupied, and those that were no longer occupied, no longer currently seen as homes to people, had a very similar style that appeared consistently. So this kind of square, sort of boxed house, very thick walls, stuccoed walls. And I began asking people about this style. Where did it come from? When did it come? When and where do you see it? And it was when I was sitting inside this house, this greenhouse in the bottom photo, in the settlement of John Miller's, just to the north of the former Miller's plantation proper. My conversation sort of turned in a really exciting direction, and the person that I was speaking to kind of turned and knocked their hand on the wall and said, oh, these walls, these are like the ones that the slaves built. And that was kind of a turning point, realizing that this vernacular style is really rooted in that historical understanding of how that plantation was built, and that kind of repeated vernacular style that is created over and over again in these different settlements that have very different occupation periods, have different patterns of occupation, some that are still filled with vibrant communities, some of which you can see on the photos on the right, have really fallen into disrepair. And a lot of these houses, even those that are not currently occupied, still feature prominently in people's memories. They can still tell me who lived there, what it was like to walk through this forest when it was lively, when there were kids running around. And you can see on the photo on the left is an interview with a descendant whose grandmother lived in this particular house on the Miller's Plantation Hill, we call it. And that house is also referred to as the Ann Miller House, and Ann Miller was the last owner of the plantation property. And so that house had been lived in for generations beyond this period of the plantation period. And so realizing that this kind of recycling of this style, this reappearance, and the consistent kind of fixing of people's family stories onto the land through these houses was kind of a turning point in realizing that it wasn't necessarily the houses themselves, but the fact that people were fixing themselves onto the land and constantly referring back to that ancestral connection, these ancestral and deep connections to the communities, even if they are not necessarily still living in those spaces. And this is just an example of some of the individuals who lent me their time and graciously showed me around the island. Many of these houses I never would have seen if it weren't for my community partners and participants who took me to them, and in walking through this land and walking through these spaces. It was hard to miss that by sharing their stories in these spaces, some of which appear relatively empty. They were re-inhabiting a landscape that, can be very tempting to sort of treat it as a historical landscape, but by walking through this space and sharing their stories at the same time, it was kind of repopulating that landscape and sharing their stories and bringing life back to this space. And the other feature that I want to talk about is one called the slave wall. And when I first started doing my research in this area, people kept telling me about the slave walls. They would come up, but it was hard for me to determine what that meant and where to find it. And every time I asked, people would look at me like, they're everywhere. Why haven't you seen them yet? Because they are everywhere. They are such an integral part of this landscape, but in many cases, they are so common that it's very easy to overlook them until somebody actually walks you out there and stands you in front of them. And then it's easy to see why people wonder why you haven't come across them yet. But this term, the slave wall, comes from the community participants who shared these stories with me. And these walls are consistently used and sort of pointed to as an example of both the horrors that their ancestors experienced, that these walls were constructed by enslaved laborers who were forced to mark out spaces on this land when it was used as a plantation for the cotton plantation, but that these walls still exist. And in that way, it's sort of a recognition of the resilience and the fortitude of the people who survived slavery and really gave birth to generations of community members who still live here today. And so these walls are certainly historic and certainly significant historical features, but they're also not static, and people are really aware of and recognize the fact that they are constantly changing, that they are deconstructed, they're altered, they are sometimes removed in the process of clearing fields for farming. Sometimes they are deconstructed and reused in new house constructions or in creating walls around people's home gardens. So these walls are both a symbol of the resilience of the past, but also not intended to be preserved as they are forever. And so again, these walls, like the vernacular style of houses that I kept seeing, I think that both of these are examples of how the contemporary community uses the material landscape, the historical materiality, as both a connection to the past and a very relevant symbol of the continued value of this place, the continued meaning of what it is to be of and from South Eleuthera. And so here I'm bringing together memory theories on critical memory and heritage, and of course, historical archaeology and contemporary archaeology. And I see that these walls, these houses sort of act as points of memory on the landscape, that they are both temporal and spatial, sort of pinpointing of moments in time on this landscape that connect that deep historical origin of these communities with the ongoing concerns and disputes around land. I'm also drawing on the idea of social stratigraphy, that these human and non-human elements, the material, the sort of non-material, but the memory, the abstract, the stories that people are sharing are layered and they're deep and they exist across this landscape, that you can't necessarily look at it as only limited to one particular time. I'm also drawing on the work of Keith Basso on placemaking and understanding how landscape is imbued with meaning, is imbued with wisdom and value. And I think that the work that I have participated in here is really indicative of the fact that memory also sits in place in these places, and that in understanding how and where memory sits on this landscape, we understand sort of the place worlds, what it means to be of and from this place. So I am also drawing on Caribbean literature and theorists from the Caribbean. I've been really kind of struck by this particular passage from Derek Walcott about reassembling the broken pieces of the Antilles and trying to understand and bring back together into a collective whole these various pieces of understanding of life and history and lived experience in this space. And that in bringing and repairing those broken pieces, we're also bringing together, we're braiding together, one might say, the materiality of this landscape, the memory that's attached to this landscape, and understanding that collective history. And this is where I see what I'm kind of theorizing as the materialization of memory, the act of piecing together object, story, and space, bringing those together, fitting them together to read this landscape, this historical and contemporary material memoryscape together. So I'm also, this has brought to mind, it's hard not to think then about Black feminist theory and about the idea of home place as the creation of a site that fosters family and community, that enables you to resist oppression, especially in the context of slavery, to create a safe space for yourself and your family, and really fostering this sense of collective attachment. And I think that that's really what this material memoryscape in Southern Eleuthera is about, is bringing together that individual memory, the social memory, the materiality of the landscape, and even those small pieces of materiality, the houses, the walls, the gravestones that exist on this landscape. And the reason why, or I should say, where I'm trying to go next with this, is thinking about what all of this means, this materialization of memory on this landscape is so important in this context in the Bahamas, is because of this constant, near constant barrage of land fights, land disputes. The court case that I began to see unfolding on my initial visit to the field in 2013 went finally to the Privy Council in England in 2018. And after a series of appeals, and the Privy Council ruled that basically neither the developer nor the community itself had a proper title, had a proper legal claim to this land. So, you know, you hear that, you kind of think that that's not good news, but the community actually saw it as an excellent ruling, that it upheld the status quo because it didn't dispossess them of their land. It didn't allow these developers to literally take the land out from underneath them. And that's something that kept coming up throughout my research, even if it wasn't about the plantation or about the landscape, whether it was elections or sort of legal issues unrelated to land rights in the Bahamas that I witnessed over the course of this research project, realizing that there really was this fear of dispossession, of losing autonomy, of losing the ability to control locally what happens in these small settlements, which are so kind of, people feel very peripheral. People feel that their opinions, their stories, their lives aren't necessarily understood or recognized in Nassau, in the main hearts of the kind of economic and political centers of the Bahamas. So this court case then that was ruled on October 15th of 2018 was just 4 days before the Bahamas government signed an agreement with Disney Cruise Lines to develop the very southern part of the island directly south of the Miller's property, which was just kind of saved to Disney to develop a private cruise port. And so this is another really contentious and complicated issue, because people were very adamant that they didn't want that first land dispute to dispossess them of land. But many South Eleutherians are actually very supportive of this particular Disney development, because they see it as a potential to invest in the community, to bring in economic investment and infrastructural investment onto the island. And you know, I personally don't always agree with that, and many people across the Bahamas disagree with that, but I think that this is an example of how the local community is really insisting on their right to determine what they are able to do with their land, who they are able to give permission to access and develop on their land. And so by looking at the material memoryscape, by looking at these contemporary events that are unfolding, and bringing together both our archaeological understandings of the materiality of the space with the contemporary community concerns, I think this is really pushing me as a historical archaeologist to recognize the contemporary, the political ramifications of our work, and the importance of understanding the concerns of our local communities that we are working with, that we're sometimes working for. And I think that it's also speaking to the importance of that kind of contemporary ethnographic approach to historical archaeology, that this site that was the kind of origin of my research is also the kind of historical origin of this community, but their concern goes far beyond the preservation and the interpretation of that plantation site. It's much bigger than that. It's much more complicated than that. And there's another issue around dispossession and the indignity of dispossession that I'm interested in following up on as I move on from the dissertation into the next stage of this work. So I will end there. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A if there's time. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you so much. That was terrific. All right, so we move to our final presentation, our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Daniela Ballenzategui. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. She holds a PhD in archaeology from Simon Fraser University and an MA from the same institution, and a BA with honors in anthropology from the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador. Her research is mainly focused on Afro-Ecuadorian historical strategies to survive slavery, structural racism, and gender discrimination. And her work is involved with aspects of material culture, ancestral territories, historical narratives, and oral traditions, as I'm sure we'll hear about today. So since 2012, she's developed a community-based archaeological project in collaboration with Afro-Ecuadorian communities from a feminist perspective. And she has numerous published articles, including a recent notable article, Collaborative Archaeology to Revitalize an Afro-Ecuadorian Cemetery, which appeared in the Journal of African Diaspora, Archaeology and Heritage in 2018. Her talk today is Mapping Cimarronaje with Afro-Descendant Women in Ecuador.
Thank you, Mac. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. Is this working? Yep. Okay.
Yep, looks great.
Thank you, Mac, for organizing this event to introduce the research of junior scholars about Afro-Latin American history and our engagement to work with descendant communities. In this presentation, I focus on the analysis of the historical construction of Maroon societies in the northern Andes of Ecuador in the context of racial and gender formations under the impact of slavery, colonialism, and the nation-state foundations. This examination is based on the historical archaeology research that the anthropologist Ana Maria Morales and I have carried out under the guidance and learning from the Afro-Ecuadorian leaders in Cimarronas, Barbarita Lara and Olguita Maldonado, a project that started around 9 years ago in the Afro-Ecuadorian ancestral territory of Imbabura and Carchi, or the Chotamira Valley. More specifically in the parish of La Concepcion, a former Jesuit hacienda. Our proposals are framed on joint collaborative community-based intercultural projects, dialogues, and learning processes with the grassroots organization, National Coordinating Committee of Black Women, Carchi chapter, that I will refer in this presentation as Conamune Carchi. Barbarita Lara and Olguita Maldonado are central representatives of this organization. According to the feminist anthropologist Rita Segato, the location of modern colonial patriarchy and the formation of the Latin American nation states silenced the histories of enslaved and Maroon women. From her present reflection of the persistence of these colonial dynamics, Barbarita Lara points out how the associated intersections between ethnicity, gender, class, and the rural location have established a foundation for gender violence and the denial of Afro-Ecuadorian women's human and civic rights. As a response, Cimarronaje is a socio-political formation that has made possible actions for freedom, resistance to the slavery system, its diverse expressions, and the colonial legacies in Ecuador. The historical and archaeological study of cimarrones, palenques, and quilombos in Latin America exposes that colonial slavery was permeable and the coexistence of Maroon individuals and groups within the setting of the plantation sites was possible. For our case, the research with Afro-Ecuadorian communities displays a vast array of Maroon actions in the Northern Andean haciendas between the 16th and the 20th century. In particular, I consider some examples of the Maroon women, the runaway women, the leaders of revolts, and also the captive women workers of the haciendas, who through their daily practices lend coherence to the community social organization of the Afro-Ecuadorian ancestral territory. Konamune Kachi applies a Black feminist perspective to the understanding of how the private space is essential in the development of identity politics within the Afro-Ecuadorian community. Racial precepts in the forms of colonial policies were expressed in the 1584 policies when the government of the Real Audiencia de Quito, colonial Ecuador, banned the forced movement of indigenous people from the highlands to the warm valleys for the production of sugarcane. In addition, based on the Defensa de Indias de Bartolomé de las Casas, enslaving the indigenous population was prohibited. Spanish colonial policies reinforced the relationship between the African descendant and enslavement and the development of sugar plantations in the highlands of Ecuador. Several groups of African descendant populations arrived in the Chotamira Valley from West Africa between the 16th and 17th century. During the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767, around 1,300 enslaved individuals were registered under the Jesuit haciendas, and 380 of those belonging to were part of the Hacienda La Concepcion. The registered individuals of the hacienda present a estimate ratio of about 1.04 males to females within a very young captive population, as you can see in this graphic. In the hacienda setting, the aggressive introduction of the European animal species for livestock husbandry within the Andean Jesuit haciendas, in combination with the monoculture of the sugarcane in the Chotamira Valley, shaped the transformation of the Andean highlands of Ecuador, all of it being part of a complex and articulated form of conquest in colonial geopolitics. The inventories of the Jesuit haciendas during the 18th century demonstrate this massive introduction of the monoculture in cattle, confirmed by the predominance of the archaeological remains of cows, pigs, and goats in the 18th century Jesuit hacienda of La Concepcion. The inventories of the buildings and other assets are also clear indications of the hacienda structure as part of a colonial pre-industrial system. Within the hacienda landscape, the enslaved population live inside of the rancherias, recorded also in the Jesuit inventory, an architectonic structure with a wall that enclosed the domestic units of enslaved workers. Rancherias, as Singleton points out for the barracones in Cuba, could be considered as a material manifestation of how the colonial elites recognized and feared the intentions of the enslaved, including their resistance. As regards the interior of the rancheria, the historical documents are silent about the construction of the African communities. The examination of the captives' domestic sphere through the analysis of meetings within the Jesuit haciendas and the Chotamira Valley illustrates their daily activities and registers significant cultural transformations happening. For instance, the study of ceramics in the 18th century meeting at the Hacienda La Concepcion related to the enslaved population shows the presence of Afro-Descendent aesthetics and also the incorporation and appropriation of European and indigenous styles. The production of handmade ceramics was a way of expressing their independent beliefs despite the restrictive context of the Jesuit Catholic values and sets of meanings. When the Jesuits were expelled from the Americas in 1767, their properties passed to the colonial state through its transitory institution called the temporalidades. The sale of the haciendas to the private owners who didn't follow the previous system for the administration of the haciendas fragmented the enslaved families and worsened their survival conditions. Faced with the severe impact of their communities, the strategies of resistance, revolt, and escape were employed by the Afro-Descendent population. An example is the story of Martina Carrillo, an enslaved woman who escaped from Hacienda La Concepcion towards the colonial city of Quito to demand relief from the mistreatment suffered at the hands of the administrator of the property, and to complain about the lack of basic services and violations of human rights there. The mechanism for establishing ethnic separation between indigenous and Afro-descendants were not exhausted after the formation of the Ecuadorian Republic in the 1830s. The argument of one fixed biological race for work on the sugar plantations survived in the post-abolition era, fueled by colonial beliefs and modern justifications. Furthermore, at the national level, the white mestizo elites linked the political authority to the masculine authority. They freely used the metaphor of a nation that was in a heterosexual union with its subordinate population also demonstrating racial fraternity across the statute lines. In this metaphor, the subordinate groups are Black and Indigenous, independent on the white elite patriarchs. Formal abolition of slavery arrived in 1852, and enslaved people became peasants under the system of Huasipungo, the same as with the indigenous population. This meant they lived from a small plot of land assigned by the hacienda owners and earned a meager cash income. However, for the local population, the abolition of slavery didn't have any effect on the social conditions and rights of African descendants. The isolation of places like the Chotamira Valley constituted an additional cause to exacerbate the continuing labor exploitation. Based on the first agrarian reform in 1965, the African descendant peasant organizations in the Chotamira Valley obtained the right to private land ownership without any obligation to the plantation owners. However, not all of them received this right. Afro-Ecuadorian women were the most affected in this distribution due to the lack of recognition of domestic economies as relevant in the production of the hacienda system. By 2017, according to Anton and other authors, only 16.3% of the land was owned by Afro-Ecuadorian women, as compared with 42.8% by Afro-Ecuadorian men. Since the formation of the Republic in the 19th century, indigenous people, peasants, poor mestizos, and the African descendant population were blamed for their Indianness and underdevelopment, which they all were expected to overcome in order to contribute to the evolution of Ecuador as a white mestizo nation. However, the possibility of indigenous groups and African descendants belonging completely to the white mestizo nation was never a goal of the nation state. This is how the precepts of separation and then homogenization within the nation-state formation historically affected the Afro-Ecuadorian population and influenced decisions about inclusion and exclusion in the official history, and about which cultural heritage becomes defined as important for recognition, documentation, and protection. However, the cultural landscape in the Chotamira Valley displays different forms of cultural appropriation, abandonment, memorialization of the remnants of the past, coexisting as a whole. From a regional point of view, La Concepcion is part of the Afro-Ecuadorian ancestral territory. the region between the southwest of Colombia in North Ecuador, stretching down the Santiago River to the Chotamira Valley, is a landscape that has been imagined and lived as one, despite the imposed national limits and provincial separations. This is a fluid form of a regional landscape that connects desires for liberation of the populations of the African diaspora from historical imposed colonial and national political limitations. At the same time, this territory is a platform for national and democratic recognition of the rights to land tenure, food sovereignty, political autonomy, and civil rights. The fluidity and integrity of the Afro-Descendent Maroon territory is marked by stories of the advancement of runaway populations from the post-Jesuit haciendas to the Esmeraldas palenques, where these independent polities were already established. This regional connection arising out of the memories of the common African past marked with tangible display of revolts and Memoryscapes of the 18th century is archaeologically evidenced by routes of escape to Esmeraldas that have left deep cultural kin networks still alive in the territory. In this landscape, Konamune Karchi, within the context of a program of ethno-education, proposed the revival of the memory of the Maroon woman Martina Carrillo in the recovery of an 18th century cemetery named as Garden of Memory Martina Carrillo for the healing from a past of slavery, as well as racial and gender violence as part of a process of historical reparation for the Maroon communities of this territory. Konamune Karchi organized with us a collaborative project to clean and map the area of the cemetery. In 2014, we defined the area of the cemetery with 192 burials. As part of an ethical archaeological intervention, we respected the community's commemoration of its dead, but excluding archaeological excavations from the present area, now defined as the old cemetery. In 2015, a proposal for the project was elaborated with Konamune Karchi, focused on the commemoration of freedom, by naming the cemetery as Garden of Memory, emphasizing the physical and tangible as a channel for the direct connections with the ancestors, commemorating the Cimarrona Martina Carrillo, who challenged the stereotype that members of the enslaved population in the Chotamira Valley were adapted to slavery and didn't rebel against its injustice, in transforming the narratives and memories of slavery in a performance of healing. Since then, the project has achieved some goals. We start the process of incorporating the cemetery as part of the intangible and archaeological national heritage sites in Ecuador, a process engaged in collaboration with the local governments. The cemetery has also been considered as part of the database for the Ecuadorian sites of the UNESCO slave route. The history of the cemetery has been integrated into the updated version of the textbooks of the Afro-Ecuadorian ethno-education, which are still undergoing revisions. Konamune Karchi has started an ethnographic research project with elders in the communities connected to the cemetery and the historical investigation of the Catholic parish in order to study the history of the site. Finally, Konamune Karchi has also locally continued to develop different events to commemorate the cemetery as part of their political actions to constantly promote the cemetery as an important element in the regional and national heritage. From the dialogue and joint work with Konamune Karchi, we are presently exploring Maroonage through an archaeological approach that offers an internal space of healing and empowerment for the historically most affected Afro-Descendant women in Ecuador. This means recognition of our gaps in the historical knowledge, the imposed silences, the use of archaeology to inform a multi-escalar proposal to document the Maroon history of this ancestral territory. Consequently, a multi-scale and interdisciplinary approach that includes the epistemologies and political practices of Konamunekarchi and historical archaeology as a platform will furnish a regional model for mapping the role of women and their multidimensional influence in the formation of the Maroon communities, including the arrival of the African diaspora population to this territory, the histories of the captive families and women within the Jesuit haciendas, including the reconstruction of the daily activities extending beyond the plantation system, the transition between the temporalidades and the sale of the haciendas to the private owners until the formation of until the formal abolition of slavery, to define the resistance strategies related to escape, revolt, displacement, and the formation of Maroon settlements. The new stage of this project also includes the analysis of the Black ecologies in the Andean landscape during the Jesuit and post-Jesuit period, as well as the effect of the different forms of extractivism to the present, as part of the colonial legacies of displacement, slavery, and the geopolitics of races. In this sense, we will be able to examine the adaptation and creative strategies embedded in the small scale economies that survive environmental degradation during the different periods of the colonial impact and later. Furthermore, this ongoing project provides inputs for clarifying the Afro-Ecuadorian territorial genealogy and supporting the processes of recovery and recognition of land tenure, food sovereignty, and anti-racist actions, all aligned with the goals of Konamunekarchi. I would like to end this presentation by acknowledging that the historical narrative that I have presented today should be considered complex, imperfect, and reflexive. The results of an intercultural encounter between women of different ethnic backgrounds raise questions and challenges for both the archaeological practice and the revival of the Afro-Ecuadorian history. I have attempted to be coherent with what I learned from the Afro-Ecuadorian maestra Barbarita Lara, and also humble with the interpretation of her ancestras. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll turn things over to David to moderate our question and answer period.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for very thought-provoking and engaged research. We just wanted to start off first with a question on positionality and your community engaged research. So we've done a few symposia that are related to community engagement, and we always have a question that relates to positionality and the sorts of interpersonal relations that you build and cultivate through your work. So I wonder if all of you could just in sequence take some time to reflect on your relationship either to present or ancestral communities where you work and conduct research, and the way that Elena phrased it, I really liked, of and by the communities. And then what sorts of challenges, if any, that you faced while doing that sort of archaeology, and what sort of opportunities you'd suggest for others doing that work and might run into these challenges. And I know that there's a wide variety here among the panel. Some of you have direct family members involved, others might have shared diaspora heritage, but come from different regions of the Americas. Maybe we should just go in the same order that you all presented in, just to keep it easy. So if Rebecca, if you could start us off.
Sure. So I came to this, I'm biracial. My mom's white, my dad's Black. And, when I growing up in upstate New York, which is where I'm from, there was only there was probably like only 2 sentences in my history books about, the enslaved experience. And I didn't see myself in that history. And I think that's what some of us are trying to do here, is to try to find some of ourselves in history. And so for me, it's about, piecing together some of my African American and African descendant community or family ancestral lines, right? Which I can trace back to Texas. Sadly, that's it. So it's a passion project for me. I'm looking to find myself and write myself into history, the history that I didn't get as a young student. And for me, I try to engage with, I have been fortunate, very fortunate to work with HBCU students for the past couple of summers, working on plantation sites in St. Croix and in Haiti. And I think that their interactions with some of these communities is just, it's integral to the work that we're all doing and we're all trying to do. I hope that answers some of the questions that you asked.
It's a big topic, so I think people can go wherever they want with it. And it just to, just to encourage also the audience, we'll try to get to as many as we can, but just, put in questions in the chat and we'll try to fuse a few together as we go. And we'll also record the chat, so those could be maybe addressed later, the ones that we can't get to. Great, thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, Gabby?
Yeah. Yeah, this question is it's a huge question. And I can really relate to what Rebecca said about this. Sorry for that noise, you can't hear it. The street is very noisy here. But yeah, the notion of trying to find yourself and your ancestors' history and past in history books for once, is also something that brought me into archaeology in the first place, because of the context of coloniality that's particularly present in Guyana, where, for example, history books are all from France and all in French language. The school system is actually a French school system that is absolutely not adapted to Guyana's history. There's almost no mention of indigenous history. When it's mentioned, it's absolutely in a postcard exotic version of what indigenous histories are. And again, the notion that the African presence in Guyana is completely limited to enslavement is just, when we grow up with that, archaeology of course seems like an interesting point to go beyond that. And then again, once we get to archaeology and we see, oh, even archaeology, which has this potential, is actually reproducing this notion, especially historical archaeology, in the sense of relying on this archive that is written by Europeans and Euro-Americans in our context. So to me, my first shock, sort of, that led me to keep digging, actually, metaphorically, who we are, came from a moment when I was talking to one of my elders and they asked me what I was doing, what was archaeology. And talking Afro-Guyanese, I just found myself without any words. I wasn't able to explain, because we don't talk about science in Afro-Guyanese. Typically, science is done in French. And so once I came to the realization that, oh, how can I explain what archaeology is? I knew how to say it's digging the dirt, but archaeology is not just that. And then that came to me asking myself, oh, is it really what I'm going to do? I'm not just digging the dirt. And also the look of in their eyes, of what are you doing? Digging the dirt? Why? It was not something that was ours. And so this particular question led me to keep asking myself, well, if I'm using archaeology to know about ourselves and archaeology doesn't make sense, what am I doing?
Great, thanks, Gabby. Elena?
Yeah, so I came to work in the Bahamas almost by accident. As I mentioned briefly in my presentation, I went as a research assistant for my professor. So I didn't know that was going to be the site that I was going to be investing in for the following, million years of graduate school. But I am an Asian woman and a Latina woman, and I was drawn to archaeology early in undergraduate because I saw it as a potential to learn about the histories of people like myself who were not represented in the kinds of history books and textbooks and history education that I loved as a child, but I didn't feel like that represented, that wasn't where I could learn about people who come from backgrounds like myself and my family. In my research in the Bahamas, it took a lot of time and energy and emotional energy and investment to earn the trust of people. And I knew that that would be required going in. But when you're actually in it, it's a struggle, and you kind of wonder how to make people, how to get people to trust you, but there is no way to get people to trust you other than showing up. And I realized maybe halfway through my work there that the way that I was perceived by people in this research site, people assumed that I was a white woman, and people also understood me as more closely associated with people who do missionary work and sort of mission volunteerism in the Bahamas. And that was an identity that I did not necessarily feel comfortable with. It certainly wasn't why I was there. But by going to the field every year for multiple weeks for as long as I could and showing up, it really was a matter of, making myself available and earning the trust of people by continuously showing up and showing that I had, that I wanted to be of service, that I wanted to listen to them. And so that kind of barrier eventually became easier to work through. But it was a struggle for me to realize that some of my participants saw and perceived me and were relating to me as a position that I did not feel comfortable in, that I didn't ever really assume that would be how I was perceived. But one of the other kind of struggles that I had was when I was introduced to this site, when I was introduced to a lot of these research partners. I was, an early in my graduate career, I was very much a student. And so when I started returning to the field over and over again, it was the transition between a student and being a researcher and sort of understanding where and how and to what extent I could hold any kind of expertise and authority. And the community members that I worked with when I started showing up on my own and not necessarily as a student researcher, those relationships were kind of indicative of what that potentially could be like, to work collaboratively with people on this kind of equal footing from the get-go. So that was sort of some of the struggles that I worked through, that I had to really think through in the course of my research.
Thanks. Yeah, Daniela, same question, though a new one came through the chat that is somewhat aligned, so you could address it, or any of the other panelists too. Just asking how, what are tips for the growing community of African expats in the Americas who are interested in this research? I think this maybe gets to something Gabby alluded to, where there, we already in archaeology deal with different levels of knowledge of our discipline, right? From pseudo-archaeological perspectives to questions like, isn't it all dug up already? What are you doing? And so different communities might have different level of exposure or access to this. So how could we cultivate different perspectives and elevate different voices who are interested in doing this work, but just might not be familiar with how to approach it?
So I wanted to answer first the question that you initiated, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the privileged position that I had as a mestiza in Ecuador, and also as a scholar in Ecuador. But at the same time, just learning from the experience of being a woman of color here in the U.S. has given me in the U.S. and also in Canada when I was doing my postgraduate preparation, that situates a lot about my interpretation about the African past and the relationship that I have with the Afro-Ecuadorian communities. So as the rest of you, my encounter with the Afro-Ecuadorian past start very early with the denial of them being part of the history of Ecuador, and how all this process of blanqueamiento of the Afro-Ecuadorian contribution to the Ecuadorian national history was also very explicit in every part and how that was inside of the mestizo culture. So that is kind of like the first encounter that as mestizo you have with the Afro-Ecuadorian past. So trying to go from there to engage into a work that is meaningful for the Afro-Ecuadorian communities, it takes a lot of steps, and also involves a lot of processes of critical thinking about your own position as a mestiza and your own work as a scholar. In archaeology, we are trained in some way just to give shape to the past, right? And when I was looking into what that means in the Chotamira Valley, in the ancestral territory of the people that I work with, I realized that the history was already lived there, right? It was active. It was an active part of their lives. So I didn't have the need to teach anything to anyone. I was learning all the time. So it was a process of learning what I have learned initially from my life as a mestiza, and learning what I learned as a historical archaeologist, and then going back to the source of that knowledge that could make their own interpretation of about the materiality, and how we are able to trace those encounters and those intersections to revitalize the past. Because as Barbarita Lara, and I learned from her mostly everything that I'm telling you today, is that they don't need anyone to uncover their past. They don't need anyone to tell them what materiality is important for what they call heritage, right? Is more about just revitalizing the past with the communities that we work with. So it's kind of like a different way of looking into archaeology based on the voices of the communities that we work with, and trying to create a different ways of narratives. And I think the most important here is to understand that in my case, the challenges that I found was outside of my relationship with the communities. It was more in the discipline. And this also talks a lot about the changes that we need to engage for archaeology, instead of just thinking again and again how to do collaborative work, because it's more about what is outside of that work that involves a lot of challenges. I don't know if that answered the second question in some way, but yeah, I see that in many aspects of the analysis of the history of the African diaspora, we try to fit everything in the African diaspora, right? And we don't understand that we have different movements that are very specific to the history of the African diaspora. And right now there are other movements and other types of mobility of different groups from Africa to the Americas that we need to try to understand how that is speaking to those encounters and those intersections that we can involve in these new ways of doing this kind of narratives for archaeology. But it's more about not just thinking about archaeology. I think it's more about thinking from the point of view of how this is meaningful for the communities that we work with.
I'm going to try to lump a few questions into one big one, and so we can take it in directions that you see appropriate, but it sort of deals with the different ways that you're grappling with issues of space and place. So we have, for instance, Rebecca's work on the colonial creation of space and this panoptic and very hierarchical structure of a plantation. And there's a question there of what the context of within which these maps were produced. And then other perspectives drawing on work with descendant communities on local ontologies and different ways of seeing space. And so the broader question, I think, is, how do we iterate between these two perspectives? In some ways, they might have to do with, structures of oppression and an agency, local agency within, in ways of navigating, those hierarchical structures, and how do we get at local ontologies, subaltern ontologies through material culture, which could be things like structures. There's also a question from Ellie about a particular plant that you might see, the ornamental snake plant that is seen in some burials. So things that are more general, like in terms of landscape and place, to things that are much more specific of, either particular species of plants, flora, fauna, or material culture that archaeologists would grapple with.
So for my part of that question, it's super easy, actually. The content, where I'm getting these maps from, well, several archives, the John Carter Brown Library has an amazing online archive for a lot of the Caribbean, but the maps are cadastral maps. Therefore, they were mainly produced for landholders that weren't living necessarily in the colony. So they needed to be very specific, right? So they're kind of like survey maps, but, I noticed that these maps inadvertently, they're very they show the boundaries of their plantation very well, but they inadvertently caught or emphasize plantations on a smaller scale between enslaved and the enslavers. So I find that kind of dichotomy really fascinating. Yeah, and as far as getting at the enslaved narrative, the archaeology, I need to get at the archaeology, which is sadly not possible at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're doing in the same order. So. Yeah, it was a really vast question. So to reply, I'm going to add on to something that Daniela was talking about, which is the need, the notion that communities don't necessarily need archaeologists to tell them what their past is like and what happened in the past. And I think this is an extremely important notion because, and it has to do with also what Elena was talking about in her talk about the need to have this ethnographic approach to archaeology, to be able to even listen and hear and see what is happening. So all of those questions that have been asked about whether the meanings regarding the plant or space and all of these, if we still remain in this disciplinary framework that still uses Western notions of reality, you won't be able to get to that ever. And so the need is to first listen to the knowledge that already exists. And it seems simple, but it's actually not, because despite the whole amount of work that has been done regarding ever since post-colonial critiques that had to do with the need to diminish the notion of authority and scientific authority, we're still dealing with this within the science. Most of the time we're saying that we're not necessarily in an authoritative place, but we are. And so I feel like this is important to realize that in order to get to that, we're gonna have to literally stay silent and listen first, and not necessarily start doing what we think is research, because just staying silent and listening is research. Just simply leaving this space to people who have the knowledge about their own past to talk is research as well. And I was gonna say something that has to do with the first question, the second question about how can African and African diaspora people get more engaged in this conversation. I think it has to do with it. There's a lot of work that has been done in order to make archaeological knowledge accessible. I really want to mention the fantastic work done by the Society of Black Archaeologists. I really want to do that shout out, but right. but what I wanted to do is in the US, because in other places in Europe, there is another society. In Brazil, There is a Rede de Arqueologia Negra as well. So this work is being done. But what I wanted to say as well is that the work is mostly by archaeologists, you know, like Daniela was saying as well. It's not necessarily African and Afro-diasporic people who have to do some work to get into archaeology, but archaeologists who have to literally change the way that the discipline is taught and is practiced in order to be meaningful. So we are in a space of epistemic violence, in a structure of epistemic violence that is manifested in every single dimensions of the work we do. And so in order to do that, we need to question it all, you know, even the simple notion of reality that we're actioning, and so we're operating. So yeah, it's a lot of work by us.
Yeah, if Elena or Daniela, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Gabby said was super valuable, and I kind of don't want to tack anything else on, but just because the work that I was doing was so intimately wrapped up in this legal case, that what I was really confronted with in this was the kind of judicial and legal reckoning that needs to happen around these questions of land rights and autonomy, especially for communities who are, you know, they have these oral histories, they can point to places on the land that are known places that are of cultural value, places that they continue to use for hunting, for farming. But the legal system doesn't recognize that, doesn't recognize those lines of evidence, so to speak. And so that was one of the first kinds of insights that I had in the early stages of my research in the Bahamas, was that people said, you know, we brought the lawyers, we brought the judge to this land and walked them through this land so we could point and say, this is how we use this space. This is where so-and-so farms. We're still using this land. Don't take it away. And then the legal system could still say, well, it doesn't look right to us, or that's not what agriculture looks like. That's not the right kind of agricultural practices. And so it's also, that's something that archaeologically, like, we can use our archaeological tools to look for signs of that, to look for the materiality. And in that kind of system, where the legal system requires certain kinds of lines of evidence, unfortunately, like people wanted me as the archaeologist to produce that data to take to court to provide those kinds of evidence. And that was, you know, that was a big and scary thing to be asked to do, but it was incredibly important. And it would have been, I think, a complete failure on my part and of this research project if we didn't attend to and give space to those sort of non-traditional, so to speak, lines of evidence that the court wasn't recognizing. And so I think that archaeologically, we're having these conversations about bringing in oral history, bringing in intangible, or looking at the intangible, where archaeology is so traditionally about looking at the tangible and the material. But a lot, as we're getting into some really explicitly political uses of archaeology, I think we also, as archaeologists, have to pay attention and also learn, unfortunately, a whole nother set of ways to speak about what we're doing, and especially in doing in the kind of collaborative work that I did, figuring out how to make what I was trying to do useful. You know, in a lot of ways, I felt like I wasn't doing true archaeology because I wasn't digging, I wasn't working with existing collections. Even that is sometimes not seen as true archaeology. But it mattered to me, it mattered to the community that there was space for all of this. And I think that there's a much bigger question than not just for the discipline of archaeology, but how we work with these other colonial enterprises, these other systems that we have to operate in currently.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's important just to recognize that we are always coming from the present with different questions that the communities are doing, the Afro-Ecuadorian, in my case, the Afro-Ecuadorian communities are doing, and they are confronting very challenging situations in the present, and we need to be aware of that, and how an archaeology will be useful for them just in the moment that we are able to connect with their main objectives, and how archaeology could be a political instrument for them is the value of our discipline. And I think it's a political responsibility that we have to be aware of how valuable is archaeology for that end, right? In terms of providing resources for land ownership, for food sovereignty, for anti-racist claims in different forms and processes that they are trying to engage into, and we are able to provide those elements. So yeah, I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Great, thanks for sharing all your work and perspectives. I think we're past 3 and Mac is going to close us out.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I wish we could spend another half hour or hour talking. And of course, it would be wonderful to do this in person someday. But let me just wrap everything up by thanking our participants. This was a wonderful session, much appreciated. And for those of you who are attendees, if you came in late, we are going to be posting a recording of the entire session on our YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel link is in the chat. And we can provide it again to everybody who registered for this session. So we'll send you all a message about that. So again, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.